Hey everyone, this is lecture 9.2. This time we're going to talk about the drug war and moral panics. In this one, we're going to lay out what exactly the drug war was as it pertains to the United States. Then we're going to talk about a phenomenon known as a moral panic and how the drug war was actually consisted mostly of a series of moral panics. In this one, we are going to, in terms of content warnings, talk about the war on drugs, which was incredibly damaging to many communities. And we're also going to talk less about the misconduct of law enforcement during this time. So, to go into it, we will first define a moral panic, which is a period of elevated social concern regarding an issue perceived to be a social problem. And then after the panic passes, it is typically revealed that the concern was either exaggerated or misguided. The thing about moral panics is they seem like something that has to happen right now, but then later on down the line, be it the next week or a couple years or a decade later, it's very obvious that it wasn't a great idea. The American War on Drugs absolutely classifies as the longest, most influential moral panic in modern history, especially modern American history. But there have been moral panics all through human history. The witch hunts of medieval Europe are another example of moral panics that kind of one happened in a big flare, and then it went away, and then it came back, and then it went away, and then it came back. As with witch hunts, as was moral panics in the United States during the 20th century. Moral panics are often rooted in racism or xenophobia, xenophobia being the fear of the other. So the fear of women and pagans was largely what drove the witch hunts of medieval Europe, and the fear of people who were not white is what fueled a lot of the war on drugs. So the war on drugs was one of the defining features of the 1900s. So for the next couple slides, we're going to be walking through the history of the 20th century. Prior to the start of the 1900s, it was considered part of your First Amendment rights to basically put whatever chemicals you choose to put into your body, which illustrates both how, I suppose, morality shifts over time, but also how we interpret our very laws shapes over time. When we think of the First Amendment, we usually think of freedom of speech, and often freedom of religion is incorporated into that. Well, previous versions of American society saw the freedom to put whatever chemicals you wanted to in your body as part of your First Amendment rights. That's how things change. This did allow people to control their personal health care. So if you thought you need a certain medicine, you can go buy that medicine and take it. But it also allowed very dangerous, unscrupulous individuals to profit from selling dangerous substances that were so-called remedies. On the more innocent side, they could be things like kind of basic herbs, moving up to things that could be a little bit more harmful, such as cough syrups that were not only heavy in alcohol, but also included things like opium or cocaine. And then moving on to the straight up dangerous would be medicines that actually contain dangerous amounts of poison, arsenic, or foods that had actual sawdust in them instead of actually food. And the thing about that was one of the major elements of what caused the laws that were passed in the early 20th century to get rid of and to regulate these sorts of issues were that people were selling, specifically in Chicago, sausages that had a high sawdust content in them. Well, we don't eat things that aren't food. We learn this when we're very young children. Well, the reason why you don't eat things that we can't digest, other than your mom told you not to, is they build up in our bodies, they build up in our stomachs, our organs, and if they don't come out the bottom of you, it can cause a blockage and an obstruction, and it can kill you. So if you eat just a little bit of sawdust over a prolonged period of time, it can lead to a very bad death, very painful death. So these laws, including the 1906 Food and Drug Act, as well as the 1913 Harrison Act that started regulating prescription drug manufacturing, especially opiates. This then, as part of this movement to regulate food and drug more and more, eventually led to the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which outlawed the production and sale of alcohol. This was part of it was a social movement in the United States to not only regulate people, but to increase sobriety in the United States. That 18th Amendment at the time was also known as the Volstead Act. In 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act was passed. That is not a typo. That is how they actually spelled marijuana for this specific act. It was actually put in there specifically to make middle-class white Americans be aware that it was not a J sound but an H sound, to make it seem more foreign. The passing of anti-marijuana laws in the mid-20th century were absolutely and very intentionally played up fears of xenophobia of non-whites. This is exemplified by a quote by Harry Anslinger, who was one of the leading proponents of the Marijuana Tax Act. He said, "There are 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the United States." This would have been in the 1930s, he claimed. "And most are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz and swing, result from marijuana usage. This marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes, entertainers, and any others." Wow, that is some old-time bigotry right there, right? So not only are we vilifying black people and Latino people, we are also vilifying people of Filipino descent, entirely different, and also musicians, other sorts of entertainers, entire types of music. We're pulling Satan into it, right? So you see that there is a religious component here, and you also are talking about women who have sexual relationships, basically, right? Who have any kind of libido. That's not good either. This kind of thinking really reared its head during this era. Historic evidence does show that there were people advocating for the passage of the Marijuana Tax Act that definitely financially benefited from it. There were a number of patents filed specifically by the DuPont Corporation for items that could otherwise have been produced out of cannabis, many of them being oil-based products such as nylon rope that would replace hemp rope, such as varnishes, types of paint that would replace hemp-based paints. And the fact that the DuPont Chemical Corporation filed many of those the same year, maybe a month before the Marijuana Tax Act went into place, is not necessarily evidence of some sort of broad conspiracy, but evidence of insider trading information that would be considered unethical at the very least. If you want to learn more about this type of thing surrounding specifically marijuana, you can check out a book called The Emperor Wears No Clothes by Jack Herer. It is not the most academic book in the world. It definitely has a pro-marijuana swing to it, but it very much it talks about portions of history that are not often talked about, so that makes the book valuable. It is entertaining to read, but if you do read it, take it with a grain of salt. In 1969, Richard Nixon was inaugurated president. Nixon is one of these characters in American history that we forget had very long political careers prior to being president. Nixon didn't just come up out of nowhere. He did run for president multiple times, including a failed bid against John F. Kennedy. Nixon's major political stances were those surrounding basically his hatred of hippies and distrust of young people of that era, especially being anti-drugs and anti anything that could be qualified as hippiness, right? Pro-war, etc. In 1970, one of the major pieces of his legislative agenda was the Controlled Substance Act of 1970. If you are going to say, when did the war on drugs start? The beginning of the Nixon administration, either being in 1969 or 1970, definitely can be said to be the beginning of the war on drugs. Everything else was kind of preamble and building up to it, but Nixon introducing the Controlled Substance Act really is where it very much started. Now, the Controlled Substance Act, what exactly was it and why was it such a big deal? And please excuse the minor, not so great formatting on this slide. The Controlled Substances Act put into place the drug schedules. These are basically the official legislated list of the things that are and are not considered drugs, and with Schedule 1 drugs supposedly being the most dangerous, with Schedule 5 drugs being the least dangerous. Now, it should absolutely be noted that this is 100% a politically motivated list. If you know how these substances operate, if you have any knowledge of the pharmaceuticals industry, it is very clear that those drugs that the pharmaceutical industry benefits from and those drugs that were politically unpopular during Nixon's first term in office, there is a relationship on where they fell on the list. Note, Schedule 1 drugs have no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. This included cannabis, heroin, LSD, and psilocybic mushrooms, so-called magic mushrooms, right? So you will also note that cannabis, LSD, and mushrooms were all closely tied to hippie subculture of that Nixon was so much against. Also note that it is saying that marijuana, that any weed joint is here, it is heavily implied just as dangerous as heroin. That is, and I believe I spelled heroin wrong there, I apologize. That is a major propaganda point of the war on drugs, is to lump things together, to make it look all the same. After especially about 1990 or so, when the war on drugs was still continuing, it absolutely did a lot of work to lump cannabis in with other drugs, and that was very much in there as well. You will then note, additionally, Schedule 1 drugs are said to have no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. That no accepted medical use bit definitely is not holding up anymore by the medical research that has been done over the last 20 years. The cannabis bit, in terms of medicinalness, is seen to be in direct contradiction to the number of states that have medical marijuana laws. Additionally, there are states and areas that are researching the medicinal purposes of LSD and the medicinal purposes of psychedelic mushrooms. The fact that they are thought to have medical use, and there's a lot of research backing that up, that goes on then to at least argue that it needs to be taken down at least one notch Probably more. Schedule II drugs have a high potential for abuse, supposedly, or are the precursor for a drug with a high potential for abuse. This includes drugs such as cocaine, methamphetamine, OxyContin, Adderall, and Sudafed. No, I take that back. Sudafed is not on the list there, which is also quite interesting. So methamphetamine, Schedule II. Okay, great. High potential for abuse, but it's acknowledging that methamphetamine could have some sort of medical purpose. It's also, this list is pointing out, that cannabis is more dangerous, supposedly, than methamphetamine or cocaine. We can see where the lack of logic is falling apart here. And then you can note all of those drugs that I have highlighted in blue are drugs that are produced by pharmaceutical companies, right? That there would be political, economic pushback if these things were made illegal. It's really one of those areas that it's so easy to fall into conspiratorial thinking, or to think that the person talking about this thing is just like some sort of drug-addled person that doesn't know what they're talking about. But the research is real and backed up academically. It really emphasizes the point that we need to be academically credible, and we need to be able to cite our sources and do all of that stuff, because there is real stuff like this. This is not a matter of conspiracy theory. This is a matter of history. Now that Nixon moved out of office, really what happened was Nixon was replaced by Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford was Nixon's vice president after he stepped down surrounding his impeachment scandal. Ford didn't really do much in this regard. Ford was then followed by Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter took a pretty much hands-off stance on this war on drugs thing. Just like the floundering years of the war on terror, it was just kind of, yeah, okay, we have a war on drugs, but whatever that means. And then we see what was the second wave of the war on drugs. And I got ahead of myself slightly there. 1971, Nixon declared drug abuse to be public enemy number one. Note that vagueness I also noted. And then in 1978, New Mexico passed the first law recognizing the medical value of cannabis. We sometimes think of the medicinal purposes of marijuana as being something that's new. The reality of the matter is these laws are actually in many places quite old. And then in 1986, we see that second wave of the war on drugs with Nancy Reagan, who, if you're not super familiar, was the husband of former President Ronald Reagan. I'm sorry, Nancy Reagan was Ronald's wife, not his husband. In 1996, California became the first state to legalize medical cannabis. That was a big deal. The medical cannabis legalization movement and actually the movement is actually called the medical marijuana movement. The difference between calling it cannabis and marijuana is largely a matter of stigma. Before the war on drugs, it was only ever called cannabis. Specifically, it was called cannabis. It was called marijuana to try to drum up some fear of Mexican people, very specifically. So actually, but the movement was called the medical marijuana movement, if you are actually talking about the history of the thing. Back on point. In 1998, from 1998 to 2020, 32 states legalized medical or recreational cannabis. That's a big deal, 32 states. In 2001, the Rohrabaugh-Farr Amendment passed in Congress, which was a piece of legislation that defunded DEA operations and would raid legal cannabis dispensaries of sorry, there's a slight miswording there. What Rohrabaugh-Farr did basically was it took money away from the DEA to raid medical marijuana dispensaries. Thus, it really made it so dispensaries could stay open. It stopped doing the economic damage to those places that had medical marijuana dispensaries, and thus made the industry actually able to grow. This is why dispensaries and how dispensaries are actually able to operate in places with medical marijuana. Sorry about that slight misspeaking. Then in 2011, the Obama administration, through a very Obama-esque move, very subtly ended the war on drugs through a series of memos and policy changes. Basically, Obama was in a tough spot. He wanted to end the war on drugs, but as was shown in the infamous Bush Mission Accomplished banner with the war in Iraq, you can't just say, okay, we're done with this major offensive. What Obama did was he basically sent out memos to the DEA, to the Department of Justice, saying we are going to operate in a way that is, quote, different than the war on drugs. And that's how he ended it. And in doing that, basically, the war on drugs ended because we were no longer going after people specifically for these purposes. However, there have been lasting ramifications of the war on drugs. During the war on drugs, the prison population in the United States skyrocketed. And more troubling, the percentage of African Americans in prison rose to 38%. It should be noted that the percentage of African Americans in the general population is only 12%. This signifies that the war on drugs had a dramatic impact in disproportionately incarcerating African Americans. You can also see in this chart that the percentage of the American population also skyrocketed with laws surrounding the war on drugs. In 1984, as we see on this chart, the Sentencing Reform Act, that is one of a number of quite generic sounding pieces of legislation that put quite a bit of power in to be able to put people in prison for cannabis and other substances. Since the end of the war on drugs, some public health programs have changed to be more oriented toward what's called harm reduction. That being defined as a public health strategy that attempts to minimize the harm caused by potentially dangerous behavior. So examples of harm reduction include providing sterile needles to heroin users. The reason why in many areas we give clean needles to heroin users is to make sure that they don't accidentally infect themselves with AIDS, infect themselves with other dangerous potential diseases, and also it gives an opportunity to contact those people and to have them check in, maybe in a medical site type setting, and just to kind of keep them healthy. I've also heard of facilities that will actually give people a safe place to inject their heroin, where there's a nurse present to make sure that they don't actually overdose. Another example of this can be giving free condoms to sex workers. Because sex workers are often people who are quite poor, and the added, you could call it business expense, of condoms can make it so that the sex workers may not actually be able to use them, even if they are able to enforce their own personal rules about condom use. So these are both very good examples of harm reduction. Drug courts are also another option. While harm reduction is very much a idea that's mostly in the area of social work, drug courts are something that can actually occur specifically within the legal apparatus, these being defined as courts in which drug offenders are sentenced to drug treatment and counseling rather than prison. That's what the drug courts are. This same approach has been used in the city of Columbus to help sex workers develop their career skills as well. In Columbus, those courts are called catch courts. So they, quote, catch the sex worker in the act of doing this and this supposed crime. And in doing that, They help people who may not have many options maybe learn a little bit about other potential careers they could use. And then those catch courts as well can be used to help people that are maybe being trafficked for sex, right? And they have an opportunity to actually escape while the courts are taking care of them, quote. It's a far more rehabilitative kind of concept. So let's talk about what exactly it means to call the war on drugs a moral panic. The war on drugs can be seen as a series of small moral panics about specific fears tied to specific drugs. Factors that fed these panics were a vague fear of, quote, drugs, right? When people talk about these things, they very rarely talk about specific drugs, at least not in the past. We are seeing some change there now that we are talking specifically about opiates or opioids. So that is actually a good move in the right direction. We also saw during the moral panics a persistent fear of, quote, the other, xenophobia, as I defined just a couple minutes ago, and a simmering fear of that the Cold War may also have been tied in with the drug war. This was really something of the beginning of the Cold War, where people would say, oh, this marijuana, oh, these drugs are being introduced by the communists, basically. That went away after a decade or so, but it really was a very real thing. People were afraid that KGB agents from the Soviet Union were intentionally giving cannabis to young people to make them weak. Again, that's a real fear people had. And then politicians were using drugs and drug dealers as a folk devil. A folk devil is defined as the identified enemy that is causing the moral panic. With a moral panic surrounding drugs, you would, in that setting, the drug dealer is defined as is the folk devil, if you will. So let's walk through these moral panics. During the 1960s, LSD and other psychedelics were of great concern to the dominant culture, and this was rooted in a strong distrust among older Americans of the youth culture of the 1960s. Richard Nixon took advantage of this for his political benefit, and it should be noted that LSD was actually originally synthesized in the year 1943. In the 1950s and early 1960s, it was also used with success to treat alcoholism, actually. And there's a very interesting article surrounding all of that right there. In the 1980s, attention shifted away from psychedelics and to drugs that are derived from cocaine, either crack or cocaine itself. Cocaine was quite popular among rich white people in the 1970s, and it was almost to the point of being mainstream. In the early 1980s, crack became much more common in poor inner city black areas. If you don't necessarily know, crack is a diluted form of cocaine that can be smoked and thus enters the bloodstream faster and with greater intensity. Sociologists observe that much of the fear of crack or drugs or gangs during that 1980s era was originally racially motivated. We can see this when we look at coverage and rhetoric surrounding so-called crack baby syndrome. It is true that if a person who is pregnant uses crack cocaine during pregnancy, then the baby will have certain health problems, developmental problems, etc. However, it is not really significantly, substantially different than a mother who might be addicted to heroin, a mother who might smoke and drink heavily, etc. So this crack baby syndrome, while there might be slight idiosyncrasies, is not this big horrible thing that it was made of the in the 80s. Additionally, then there was fear that these quote crack babies would become an overwhelming burden to society, that they would become these super killers, etc. If that would have happened, it would have happened in like the early 2000s. But it didn't, and it wasn't true, and it was debunked. But it was the stuff of the nightly news almost every single night. There is another link right there at the bottom of this slide that you can access that if you want to learn more about why there really is no such thing as a crack baby. As a result of the crack moral panic, Ronald Reagan took advantage of this for political benefit by putting into place what was known as the 100-to-1 rule. Thus, possession for 28 grams of crack cocaine would yield a 5-year mandatory minimum sentence for the first offense, and it would take 500 grams of powder cocaine to prompt the same sentence. So let's restate that. For one amount of powder cocaine, the same amount of crack cocaine would elicit a 100 times stronger sentence, right? That is, it's bunk, it's nonsense, it's just silly. And if you want more information on that, check out www.drugpolicy.org. However, in the year 2010, under the Obama administration, they also passed the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010, which shifted it from a 100-to-1 rule to a 8-to-1 rule. This acknowledging that, okay, maybe crack is somewhat more dangerous than powder cocaine. We'll acknowledge that, but we aren't going to put people to jail for decades longer. We are going to put them to jail a little bit longer. And again, is that a perfect solution? Probably not, but it is the type of compromise that it's about as good as we get in our society, basically. So, during the 1990s, there was also a great fear of phenyl cyanide. I don't say it very often. PCP. This specific drug causes hallucinations, violent behaviors, and may have an influence on adrenaline. So this also was another one of the quote super drugs of the war on drugs era that were going to lead to super criminals. You can check out that article right there on how utterly horrible PCP was. Again, don't go out and do PCP, but it was hyped. It was really played up to get people really afraid, as opposed to critically thinking and being critically nuanced. Is PCP, are things like methamphetamine dangerous to an individual? Absolutely they are. Are your second graders going to be doing methamphetamine between classes in their elementary school? No, right? That is really, those wild leaps were the stuff of the war on drugs. In the early 2000s, bath salts became the moral panic of the latter years of the war on drugs. If you've never heard of them, bath salts were a then legal substance that could be sold in gas stations and corner stores. They were I don't know if they're still produced in any way, but they were a stimulant and had hallucinogenic properties, similar to a combination of cocaine and MDMA. Bath salts are actually derived from a plant called the gat plant. Gat is, I think it's properly pronounced as if it were G-A-T. Gat is a stimulant plant that is often chewed in parts of Central Africa. When the plant is in its natural state, it is about as potent as coffee, right? It's like one of those kind of things, a lot like the coca leaf is, if you're familiar with that. But when it's derived, it becomes a much more powerful stimulant. This fear of bath salts really peaked with the so-called 2012 zombie attack, in which this person attacked another person and ate his face. I don't think he actually killed the person, but he like tore off parts of his flesh and ate his face. That guy was actually sober. There were no drugs found in that person's system. It was just automatically assumed by the officers on the site that it was bath salts. And to me, the idea of someone who's completely sober doing that is a deep. It's much more frightening to me. And the last idea I want to introduce is this idea of the iron law of prohibition. This is a concept that as law enforcement becomes more intense, the potency of the prohibited substances will become more intense. We saw this during the Prohibition era, where before Prohibition, most people, alcohol-wise, were just drinking beer and wine. Then during the Prohibition era of increasing illegality, that is really when things like whiskey, things like rum, things like stronger spirits really kind of became part of American drinking culture. You didn't see a lot of liquor prior to that point in just common Americana. And then also, with increasing law enforcement and legality is when moonshine became, again, you can actually find moonshine a lot of places now in the United States, but it didn't exist at all prior to Prohibition. Similarly with cannabis, cannabis before being made illegal was relatively weak compared to modern strains, and very high THC, highly intoxicating strains of cannabis. It is thought, it's very hard to prove, it was thought that those came into being during the War on Drugs era, and then we see things like synthetic cannabinoids coming into place that are actually very, very dangerous and never probably would have come into place if not for cannabis being illegal itself. And then we have some other examples there as well. Okay, that's it for this lecture. If you have any questions, just let me know.